Дякую, Irina. Good evening to everybody. I will start with a small historical background of the Ukrainian-US security policy relations, and then we'll come to the recent negotiations and the draft agreements. So, first of all, everybody knows that following the dissolution of the European Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, and the proclamation of Ukraine's independence, Ukraine actually inherited a massive nuclear arsenal. And this gave rise to the need for security assurances in exchange for Ukraine's relinquishment of its nuclear weapons. On January 1994, the trilateral statement was signed by Ukraine, United States, and Russia. Under this agreement, Ukraine agreed to transfer its nuclear warheads to Russian Federation, while the United States, Russia in turn, confirmed their intention to respect Ukraine's security. And the culmination of these arrangements was the signing of the Budapest Memorandum on December 1994. So under this memorandum, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia pledged to respect the independence, sovereignty, and existing borders of Ukraine, and also to refrain from the threat or use of force against Ukraine. It is important to emphasize that these commitments took the form of rather political assurances than legally binding guarantees of security. Security guarantees could have included such provisions for direct military intervention by the United States or any other country like United Kingdom in the event of aggression, something that was not provided at the time. And the Budapest Memorandum became the first key document defining the post-Cold War format of Ukraine-United States security relations, though its nature was more, as I already said, political than legal. After that, following the 2004 Orange Revolution, security cooperation intensified. The United States supported Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic aspirations, although the issue of the formal security guarantees or NATO membership remained unresolved. A milestone in bilateral relations was the United States-Ukraine Charter on a Strategic Partnership, signed on December 19, 2008. This document established the foundation for cooperation in defense, security, economics, and democracy. The 2008 Charter declared support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, outlined directions for military cooperation, and highlighted Ukraine's prospects for integration into Euro-Atlantic institutions. Effectively, from 2008 onward, Ukraine-US relations were elevated to the level of a strategic partnership. To implement the Charter's provisions, a bilateral US-Ukraine Commission was established to oversee particular cooperation projects, particularly in defense, reform, and military exercises. Although this charter was also political in nature and lacked a legally binding mutual defense clause, it laid the groundwork for deeper interaction between the defense sectors of both nations. So, after the onset of Russian aggression in 2014, the occupation of Crimea and the war in Donbass, security cooperation between Kyiv and Washington significantly intensified. The United States promptly condemned Russia's actions and provided diplomatic support to Ukraine on the international stage. A brand new phase in bilateral security agreements occurred in 2021. On September 1, 2021, during President Zelensky's visit to Washington, the parties issued a joint statement on strategic partnership, reaffirming core security principles and agreeing to update the 2008 Charter. On November this year, in Washington, the foreign minister signed a new US-Ukraine Charter on strategic partnership. So this document replaced the 2008 Charter and reflected the new security realities. The 2021 Charter also references the new strategic defense framework, a bilateral agreement between the defense ministries signed on August 2021, outlining military cooperation priorities through 2026. This included joint training, exercises strengthening Ukraine's Navy and Black Sea security. The United States explicitly confirmed its commitment to NATO's open door policy and Ukraine's right to determine its foreign policy course independently. The full-scale Russian invasion on February 24, 2022 became like a turning point that tested the practical effectiveness of previous agreements and catalyzed the rapid development of new security cooperation formats between Ukraine and the United States. By early 2023, the total volume of US military assistance to Ukraine had reached unprecedented levels. According to the US Department of State, as of March 2023, the United States had provided over $66.5 billion in military aid since the beginning of the full-scale war. This clearly established the United States and Ukraine's largest security donor in its modern history. One of the earliest and most symbolic United States initiatives to support Ukraine in 2002 was the reveal of the World War II Lend-Lease program. On May 9th, 2022, President Joe Biden signed the Ukraine Democracy Defense Lend-Lease Act of 2022. This law temporarily simplified procedures for arms transfers to Ukraine, granting the US president expanded powers to quickly deliver weapons and equipment on loan or lease without bureaucratic delays. Although the majority of aid was actually provided as grants, free of charge, the Lend-Lease Act became a powerful political symbol of the US resolve to equip Ukraine with everything needed for self-defense. An essential coordination mechanism for international military support led by the United States was the establishment of the so-called Ramstein format, the Ukraine Defense Contact Group. This contact group allowed real-time coordination among dozens of countries to supply arms, avoid duplication or delivery gaps, and develop joint decision on training Ukrainian troops. A real breakthrough for Ukraine came on June 13, 2024, during J7 summit in Italy, when President Joe Biden and Volodymyr Zelensky signed the bilateral security agreement between Ukraine and the United States for a 10-year term. This document became the most significant and up-to-date format of security arrangements between the two countries. The agreement takes the form of an executive agreement and therefore does not require ratification by the US Senate. It is designed for a 10-year period and can be extended thereafter. In the preamble, the parties reaffirm their commitment to the principles of the UN Charter, respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, and Ukraine's right to self-defense, as stated in Article 51 of the UN Charter. The United States clearly stated that Ukraine's future lies in NATO, referencing the Vilnius Summit decision that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance once all conditions are met. Accordingly, the goal of the new agreement is to support Ukraine on its path to NATO and enhance its defense capacity to ensure just peace. The bilateral security agreement serves as a framework document outlining the strategic directions of cooperation in security and defense. It includes provisions on a joint policy to counter aggression, mechanisms for high-level consultations in the event of the threats to Ukraine, and priorities for defense assistance, from strengthening the capabilities of the Ukrainian armed forces to monitoring the use of provided weapons, joint training, intelligence sharing, and demining efforts, etc. At the same time, the agreement explicitly states that it is not a mutual defense treaty. It doesn't oblige the US to automatically use military force to defend Ukraine. Instead, it outlines a political commitment to consult and provide support through military agreed mechanisms. The agreement also devotes significant attention to Ukraine's economic recovery, energy sector, rule of law reforms, anti-corruption efforts, and civilian oversight of security structures. The Ukraine-US Declaration on Security Partnership represents a major step in formalizing security cooperation adapted to realities of war and post-war recovery. Thus, in an unprecedentedly short period from 2022 to 2024, the format of Ukraine-US security arrangement evolved from a declared so-called strategic partnership to a concrete long-term security pact, including elements of guarantees and mechanisms for practical and defense cooperation. From the standpoint of international law, Ukraine-US security arrangements fall into various categories of legal instruments. We can see political declarations and we can see international treaties. The 1994 Budapest Memorandum was so-called sui generis international agreement. Also signed by heads of state and registered as a UN document, it was not ratified and did not acquire the status of a legally binding treaty. It is often characterized as a political commitment or memorandum of understanding, lacking an enforcement mechanism. The absence of clear guarantees and sanctions for violations was one reason for its ineffectiveness. When Russia violated the memorandum, Ukraine had no legal tools to demand military protection from neither US nor UK. This precedent exposed a gap in international law. States may pledge to respect sovereignty, but without a formal defense alliance. Such assurances prove insufficient to deter aggression. On the contrary, the 2024 declaration and its accompanying 10-year agreement have a fundamentally different character. While the agreement is also not an interstate treaty under Article 2 of the 1969 Vienna Convention, since it is not ratified and does not create reciprocal defense obligations, it is a written document signed by head of the state and possesses features of a political type international agreement. The text explicitly provides for its registration with the UN Secretariat, meeting the requirements of Article 102 of the UN Charter and enhancing its international legitimacy. In legal terms, such an agreement constitutes non-binding soft law. Its implementation depends on the good faith of the parties rather than enforceable mechanisms. The US deliberately avoided a format requiring Senate ratification. Instead, a flexible executive agreement format was chosen, allowing for swift amendments and even termination. This means that formally neither side is legally bound. If, for instance, a new US administration decides to suspend assistance, it may withdraw from the agreement. As time has shown, Ukraine's concerns about the durability of US support were not unfounded. The change of administration in 2025 brought a sharp shift in the US foreign policy toward Ukraine. So, the inauguration of Donald Trump in January 2025 coincided with a critical stage of the Russia-Ukraine war, when Ukraine was in urgent need of international solidarity and material support. Instead, the new administration radically altered its political course. In February 2025, for the first time, the United States joined Russia, along with Belarus and North Korea, in voting against a UN General Assembly resolution which condemned Russia's initiation of the war. This unprecedented move ended the unity of Western alliance in support of Ukraine and signaled that Washington was no longer prepared to automatically defend Ukraine on the international stage. Expert also described this shift as a willingness to sacrifice Ukraine for a dubious quick peace. Indeed, President Trump openly shifted the focus from resisting the aggressor to pressuring the victim. blaming Kyiv for providing the war and demanding painful concessions to end hostilities. Subsequently, Washington demanded that Ukraine sign an agreement transferring rights to part of its future extraction of critical minerals to the US side, without providing clear defense guarantees in return. This transactional approach starkly contrasts with the Biden administration policy, which was based on supporting Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and deterring the aggressor collectively. Trump's refusal to unconditionally support Kyiv introduces new threats to Ukraine's security. Long-term aid commitments made by the previous administration are now under question. Trump's early steps as president shows that he does not consider himself bound by any prior agreements or promises regarding Ukraine. This renders even limited guarantees, such as consultations or weapons supplies, uncertain. And Ukraine's NATO accession, a key strategic goal of our country, has been indefinitely postponed under the new circumstances. The Trump administration has previously been skeptical of NATO expansion, particularly of admitting a country at war. The absence of clear path to NATO membership deprives Ukraine of the most effective collective security mechanism under Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. In theory, Kyiv could rely on an alternative US guarantees, bilateral agreements, or major non-NATO ally status. But such guarantees are also unlikely, given the new administration reluctance to commit to long-term obligations abroad. Thus, Ukraine risks being left alone against a more powerful aggressor, undermining the very spirit of collective security enshrined in the UN Charter. An equally important aspect is Washington's diplomatic initiatives for resolving the war. The Trump administration has demonstratively shifted focus from multilateral formats like those involving the European Union, NATO, or even United Nations to bilateral negotiations with key actors. In particular, Trump announced his intention to negotiate directly with Vladimir Putin to end the war, and this is already done by phone conversation, effectively sidelining Ukraine from defining the terms of peace. The Trump administration has openly signaled that European security is no longer a priority for Washington, casting doubt on US commitments within NATO and other alliances. From the perspective of international law, such behavior undermines the principles of good faith in alliance agreements and may be interpreted as a withdrawal from previously assumed political commitments. Thus, the current strategy pursued by Trump's administration is fracturing what was once a united Western front. For Ukraine, this means the weakening of the international legal guarantees it has relied upon. In response to these new challenges, Kyiv has been compelled to urgently seek ways to maintain United States support, including through mutually beneficial economic arrangements. Against this backdrop, the idea emerged of concluding a special agreement between Ukraine and the United States on joint extraction of strategically important mineral resources. This concerns resources such as rare earth elements, lithium, titanium, graphite, uranium, gas, oil, other critical minerals for high-tech industries and defense production. Ukraine is rich in such resources. According to government estimates, Ukraine has deposits of 22 out of the 34 minerals classified by the European Union as critical, including substantial reserves of graphite, approximately more than 20% of global supply. This potential is highly attractive to the United States, which seeks to diversify its sources of strategic raw materials and reduce dependence on China and Russia. The idea behind the resource agreement is to attract American capital and technology to develop Ukrainian subsoil resources, with a portion of the resulting revenues used to offset the massive US expenditures on aid to Ukraine. From the Trump administration perspective, such as supporting exchange agreement allies with a notion of fairness for the American voter. For example, the funds invested in Ukraine should be returned with a profit to the American nation. Meanwhile, Ukrainian authorities hope the agreement will improve relations with the EU administration and pave the way for long-term US security commitments to Ukraine. Well, what about the aggressor? The Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman Maria Zakharova questioned the legitimacy of such an agreement, alleging that President Zelensky was offering resources to Washington that Ukraine no longer controls due to the shifts in the front line. This statement reflects Russia's attempt to undermine confidence in the deal, but casting doubt on Ukraine's ability to fulfill its obligations under it. President Vladimir Putin also made several statements that can be interpreted as reactions to the potential agreement. He reportedly offered Donald Trump access to mineral resources located in Russia-occupied Ukrainian territories. Additionally, Putin expressed Russia's willingness to cooperate with the US on developing critical mineral resources, including those on temporarily occupied Ukrainian side. In an interview with Russian media, he claimed Russia possesses far larger rare earth reserves than Ukraine. So these proposals may be viewed as an attempt by Russia to seize the initiative and present the US with an alternative partnership, potentially bypassing Ukraine. Russia may respond to such an agreement in various ways. One possible scenario involves an escalation of military operations in the regions where mineral deposits are located. Diplomatic pressure on both Ukraine and the United States could also be intensified in an attempt to disrupt or renegotiate the deal. Thus, a potential Ukraine-US mineral extraction agreement represents a complex geopolitical issue that will likely provoke a multifaceted and possibly negative reaction from the Russian Federation. This reaction from the aggressor state could significantly influence future relations among Russia, Ukraine, and US, as well as the broader regional landscape. So what about the prospective agreement? What about its analysis? Okay, according to the universally recognized norm of international law, a state has exclusive sovereignty over its natural resources and subsoil. The principle of permanent sovereignty over natural resources, enshrined in UN General Assembly Resolution of 1962, confirms the right of a state to freely dispose of its natural wealth in the interest of national development. Thus, any arrangement with a foreign state or company must not deprive Ukraine of sovereign control over its resources. Based on details reported in the media, the proposed agreement would take the form of a cooperation framework on extraction and investment rather than a concession granting ownership of subsoil rights. Specifically, the discussed plan includes establishing a joint reconstruction investment fund, to which Ukraine would contribute 50% of the revenues from future monetization of state-owned mineral resources, including oil, gas, and other materials. These contributions would continue until a specified threshold is met, as reported $500 billion, which the US purportedly expects to recover as a repayment for the prior assistance to Ukraine. The accumulated funds would then be reinvested into development and reconstruction projects in Ukraine. On the US side, long-term financing is expected to be provided to foster a stable and economically prosperous Ukraine. Formally, this mechanism implies joint management of profits from resource extraction, but does not transfer ownership of the minerals themselves to the United States. They remain the property of the Ukrainian people. However, the line between partnership and loss of economic autonomy is delicate. If the agreement was concluded under significant external pressure, questions arise regarding to its legitimacy. By the way, Budapest Memorandum explicitly prohibits the US and other guarantors from using economic coercion against Ukraine for their own benefit. In this case, it is difficult to classify the US action as a direct coercion by force. The military threat to Ukraine originates from Russia, not from the United States. Nevertheless, an ultimatum demanding economic concessions in exchange for vital defense assistance creates a troubling precedent in which security and commerce are dangerously intertwined. From an international legal standpoint, for such an agreement to be sustainable, it must be perceived as a voluntary partnership between two sovereign states, not a deal imposed on a weaker party under duress. Crucially, the latest publicly available draft of the agreement does not include direct United States security guarantees to Ukraine, the very condition Kyiv has insisted upon, and actually every Ukrainian citizen is waiting. Instead, the document employs general formulations expressing a desire to see Ukraine like free, sovereign, and protected, without committing to specific obligations. Thus, potential US-Ukraine resource agreement represents an intersectoral precedent at the intersection of international law, security, and economics. It could simultaneously bolster Ukraine's material security base and raise new, complex questions regarding Ukraine's sovereignty and the fairness of international relations. From the standpoint of international relations theory, the new US course may be interpreted as a return to realist great power politics, where the interests and deals of major players take precedence over the rights of smaller or weaker states. Ukraine's security environment in 2025 has become increasingly precarious. Legal guarantees are eroding, military support is conditional, and diplomatic space for defending national interests is narrowing. This undoubtedly changes the current international legal order, which is based on the principles of security inviolability and the non-recognition of territorial acquisitions by force. So here we come to some conclusions. First, Ukraine and the United States have traversed a complex path from the vague security promises in the early 1990s to a deep strategic partnership in the 2020s. Historical analysis reveals that early agreements, such as Budapest Memorandum, failed to provide a reliable mechanism for protecting Ukrainian sovereignty. The United States-Ukraine security arrangements from 2022 to 2024 were based on fundamentally different principles. Instead of mere declarations of respect for sovereignty, they included concrete measures to enhance Ukraine's defense capabilities, extensive military aid, joint training, intelligence sharing, etc., etc. On the other hand, the presidency of Donald Trump from 2025 onwards has created a new strategic reality for Ukraine in which security guarantees must be renegotiated. From the standpoint of international law, the US retreat from its role as a leader of collective support for Ukraine undermines established deterrence mechanisms and calls into question the strength of earlier commitments. For Ukraine, this means an urgent need to intensify diplomatic efforts, engage alternative security guarantors like European Union, like individual European countries, and reinforce its own armed forces, and also to seek to keep the US within its partnership orbit by forming shared interests. The Strategic Resources Agreement exemplifies such an unconventional step. anchoring a geopolitical alliance in economic cooperation. At the same time, the risks lie in the possibility that Ukraine may jeopardize part of its sovereignty and lose flexibility in both domestic and foreign policy. Agreements reached under duress are difficult to revise later. To minimize these risks, it is essential for us to establish appropriate legal frameworks from the outset. The parties' mutual obligations, including desirable security guarantees for Ukraine, must be clearly defined. The implementation process should be transparent and accountable, and the agreement should include provisions for flexibility in case of changed circumstances, like a clause on the potential review of terms after, let's say, several years. It must also comply with international law and Ukrainian legislation to ensure that agreement is legally sound. Under the complex condition of 2025, Ukrainian diplomacy and the legal community must act proactively, leveraging all available instruments of existing assurances and creatively shaping new support mechanisms, such as the aforementioned strategic partnership in mineral resources. Only such a comprehensive approach can transform a potentially vulnerable situation into new opportunities for strengthening Ukraine's sovereignty and long-term security, not only in Ukraine, but in whole Europe. Thank you for your attention, colleagues.